As we begin Math 141, the first section gets into solving linear equations. So I do want to review a little bit with you about adding and subtracting integers. And what I want to do is do this in the concept of money. So a lot of times, uh, money can be used to kind of explain how integers work. So the first thing though is, for us, what does money look like today? So one of the first things I would like you to do is go to the discussion board in Blackboard and describe what is in your wallet, if you will, or your money purse. This assignment will count for 5 points, and it will be due on January 25th. So I'm just kind of curious, what does your money look like these days? What's in your wallet? So let's move into integers. So the integers is the set of positive and negative whole numbers. So when we see this word set notation, we use these little braces. So they kind of look like this. You should also be able to see them on your keyboard. They're, if you're on a computer, they're just right next to the capital P on your keyboard. So there's a left print or a left brace and a right brace, if you will. So we have the set of positive and negative whole numbers. Another important thing is to understand what a whole number is. Whole numbers itself is actually the set of 0, 1, 2, 3, 4, so forth and so on. So my definition is not quite perfect because there's one number here that's not positive, nor is it negative. So technically, when we talk about integers, the way we describe the integers is I usually write it as dot, 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 which means continue on. I usually put like a -3, a -2, -1, 0, 1, 2, 3, dot, 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 and close your brace there. So the set of integers looks like that. They look really good on a number line because a number line kind of illustrates direction. So if I can insert a line on my paper here, so if I draw a line here, so if we talk about integers, usually, let's see if I can get this thing to work again. So zero is usually out here in the middle. And then if we go right of zero, that's a positive direction. So 1, 2, 3. And this arrow is like the dot, dot, dot continues on in that pattern. So notice how there's a pattern there. If I go left of zero, we have -1, -2, -3. And this arrow kind of means we can continue going left in that pattern. So again, one of the things that's missing here is we don't have to deal with decimals or fractions at this time. We're only working with positive, negative whole numbers, and also a very special number, zero, which is neither positive nor negative. So we'll talk more about zero as the class moves on. So as I was saying, integers can be understood by using money. So when it comes to money, uh, there's what's called having money, and the opposite of having money is not having money. So having money a lot of times represents positive integers, while not having money, a lot of times we'll call that owing money, or that's our debt, if you will, money that we don't have. Now, money that we have, we actually can touch it. That's concrete. But debt is very abstract. We cannot touch debt. It's just something that's out there, but we as adults understand the concept of debt. It's not having money. It's something that you typically have to pay off. So negative numbers typically will be used to represent negative numbers in this exercise. So again, this concept of money helps model and make sense of adding and subtracting integers in real life situations. So money that you have is going to be considered positive. So a +5. So typically we don't put the plus, we just write the symbol 5. So the symbol 5 for us means a +5. Meanwhile, money that you owe, or what we call debt, it's going to be represented by a negative number. So an example would be like -$3. So dash three stands for a -3. Or if we're talking about money, that means I owe $3, if you will, in that sense. So a +5 means I have $5. A -3 means I owe or I'm in debt $3. So when it comes to adding integers, we know that a positive plus a positive, that just means you're going to gain more money. So if I have $4 and I combine that with, so remember the word plus kind of means combine. So if I have $4 and I combine that with two more dollars, that means I have $6. So here in algebra, we won't put all that. We'll just simply say if I have a +4 and I combine that with a +2, my result is going to be a +6. So remember the plus symbol means to put together or combine. So if I have a negative number and I combine it with another negative number, what's going to happen is your debt just got bigger. So if I'm in debt $3 and that if I combine that to a debt of five more dollars, my total debt now is -8. So in algebra, if we will, a -3 plus sometimes we'll use a -5 in parentheses to kind of clarify that. So the parentheses are here to clarify, hey, this is a negative, not a subtraction symbol. So if I have a -3 and I combine that with a -5, that represents then a -8. So a $3 debt combined with a $5 debt means we have a total debt now of a -8. So you kind of start to pick up on some patterns here with adding integers, and you can use those patterns to create rules. Now, when it comes to adding a positive and a negative, the catch here is, do we have more money or do we have more debt? There's a catch here. So you got to compare the amounts to see if you have money left over or do you still owe it. So we got to keep that in mind in that sense. So if I do an example, if I say I have $6 and I combine that with -$2, if you will, if I put those together, are we going to have money left over or are we going to owe money? So notice that debt is going to remove what we have. A lot of times I'll use income here. So a lot of times a positive number, I may use the word income. And the word negative here, sometimes I can use the word debt as a concept. So if I have a $6 income and I add it to a $2 debt, notice that this $2 debt removes $2 from income. So technically, this problem also means the same thing as 6 minus 2, because I'm removing $2 from what I already have. So if I have $6 and I remove $2, notice that that's going to be this result of $4 left over. So notice that 6 plus -2, if you will, sometimes I'll put that in parentheses, sometimes I won't. Notice how that's the same thing as 6 take away 2. Either way we do it, our result in the end is going to be $4, but notice that that's $4 that we still have. Meanwhile, if I have, say, let's say I have $5, but I combine that with uh, an $8 debt. Now the question is, do you have money left over? Are you still in debt? So notice that the math here is we have $5, but we have to pay off an $8 debt. But notice how we can only pay off $5 of our debt. So a lot of times mathematically, I'll write this as 8 take away 5 as a step because I have, and I'm going to think of this as an $8 debt, but I'm only able to pay off or remove, if you will, $5 of that debt. So I end up with this 3. But what I got to understand though is this 3 is actually a -3 because when I write this, I'm thinking this as my debt now. and I'm removing part of my debt, and I'm left with this $3 of debt. So this ends up being then a -3 in the end because I have to still compare the amounts, and my logic says I still owe money. So this has to be a -3. So notice that the process here is twofold. So one of the things we do in working with positive and negative numbers, notice how it turns into a subtraction problem. So if we're adding a positive and a negative number, we're subtracting. But the catch is, once we subtract, do we have money left over? Do we still have some income left over? Or are we in debt? Do we still owe money? So if I give you an example of, again, say I do a positive number, say a 7, and I add to that a -10. What we pick up on is this $7 is income, but I'm combining it with a $10 debt. So when we do that, you have to ask yourself, do I still have some money left or am I going to be owing money? Well, since my debt is bigger than my income, my answer's got to be I'm in debt. The question is how much money am I in debt? Now, you can do that mentally. Okay. You can do that mentally. And if you can, that's what we want you to be doing because this is not hard math. But mathematically, what you would have to do to start with, though, is subtract. So when I subtract, I got to go 10 minus 7. So notice how I'm ignoring the positive and the negative symbols here. I'm just subtracting the 10 minus the 7 because the bigger number's got to go first here. So 10 minus 7 is going to give me a 3. But the question is, in the end, am I going to have income or am I going to have debt? And that's where, again, you got to go back and compare. Well, since I had more debt, my answer's got to be debt. So the answer's got to end up being a -3. So when it comes to adding a positive and negative number, notice how it starts to turn into a subtraction problem. But then we have to decide whether the answer is a positive or a negative. Okay. So we'll talk more as we move forward on some rules. So subtracting integers. So remember, subtraction kind of means to take away or remove. So keep that in mind. Subtraction in the real world means we're removing or taking away. So keep that in mind. Subtraction means taking away or removing money. Okay. So if I'm subtracting a positive number, that means I'm spending money. So if I'm subtracting my income is going out. If my income is going out, if you will, that means I'm paying off something. I'm spending money. I'm using my credit card. I'm writing a check, or I'm picking up my wallet, and also, if I have cash, I'm giving my cash to somebody else because those are all positive concepts. Now, if you're subtracting a negative number, this means you're removing debt, which actually means you're adding value. So this is an interesting thing. So if I subtract debt, if I remove debt, think about that. If you remove debt, does your value go down or does your value go up? Well, if I'm removing debt, my value actually goes up, not down. So that's a little weird for us because we think of subtraction means your value is going down. That's only if you're subtracting income. If I'm removing or subtracting debt, I'm actually going up in value. So that's very, very important to us. So when it comes to subtraction, it depends on what kind of numbers we're actually subtracting. So keep that in mind. So if I look at this example, if I have $10 and I spend $4, so that kind of looks like this. I have $10 and then you're going to, oops, let's look at that a little bit more closely. If you're going to spend $4, that's going to be 10 minus 4, which knows how I'm removing income, if you will. So I'm left with $6 of income. So they're using the positive numbers here. I have a positive 10, but I'm spending, which means I'm subtracting $4 of my income, if you will. and I'm going to be left with $6 of income. So we don't have to use all these positives here. A calculator actually doesn't even like that. So 10 minus 4 is 6. So we're kind of showing you this just to kind of help you clarify, but you have to understand that 10 is a positive number and you're subtracting 4, which is a positive number, and in the end, you're still going to end up with a 6. So if we look at this next example, if you owe $6, notice that you're already down $6 and you pay $2 and you pay $2 more. So I'm sorry, let me read that a little more closely. You owe $6 and you pay $2 of it. So if we pay $2 of it, what we're doing is we're removing debt. So what we're doing is we're removing $2 of debt, if you will, because we're paying it off. But notice how if I remove $2 of debt, that's the same thing as having debt and increasing my value by 2. Because if I pay off $2 of debt, I shouldn't be further in debt. I should be coming out of debt. So this turns into actually a negative 6 plus 2. And notice how if we have a negative and a positive, that's actually a subtraction problem. 6 minus 2 is going to give me a 4. But we have to compare. Are we still going to be in debt or are we going to be out of debt? Well, since I have $6 of debt and I only have $2 of income here, that tells me I'm still going to be $4 in debt. So notice that this statement, negative 6 take away a negative 2, is actually a negative 4, if you will. So this is interesting. So notice how this negative 6 minus this negative 2 is actually the same thing as negative 6 plus 2. So we're going to pick up on some patterns here. So if I look at this next example, you owe $3. Notice how I'm starting at negative 3, and you gain $5. Well, if you gain $5, that means you're adding $5 to your balance sheet. But notice how if you look at this, I have a negative 3 and I'm combining it with a 5. Notice how again, since the signs are different, we're subtracting. 5 minus 3 is 2. But the question is the answer a positive 2 or is it a negative 2? Well, since I have more income, my answer is going to end up being a positive 2. So key things to remember. If you remove debt, that's increasing your money. Adding debt decreases your money. Now, for us, if we want to start developing some rules, let me see if we have some rules here. Now, let's make some rules. So if we have some rules, what we have then is if we're adding integers, if you will, what we pick up on is if the signs are the same, if I have same signs, if you will, what you do is just combine and keep the sign. So if I have, say, 6 plus 4, notice how I'm adding. Notice how it's a positive 6 and a positive 4. That's same signs. So what the directions are then is just add the numbers together. 6 plus 4 would be 10, and you keep the sign so it stays as a positive 10. And notice how if we use the money thinking, I have $6 and I combine it to $4, would that equal $10? So notice how you can also add the label of 10, add the label of dollars on that and reason it out as well. So if I have a negative 7 take away, I'm sorry, adding, say, a negative 5, notice how these are same signs. I have a negative 7 and I'm adding to that a negative 5. What we pick up on is all you really got to do is add the two numbers together. 7 plus 5 is 12, but you just keep the sign as a negative 12. So if you have a $7 debt and you combine that with a $5 debt, your answer is going to be a $12 debt. Now, when it comes to subtraction, this gets a little bit where you have a couple ways of thinking. So in algebra, we like to see it as addition. So we start to see what we call terms. So when we see terms, what we want to do is think of this as addition. So if I have 6 plus 2, a lot of times what I'll do is I'll use what's called the circle method. So my terms are a 6 and a positive 2. So 6 and a positive 2, we simply say, well, that's a 6. Well, let me try that again. So since we're subtracting, let me try that again. So let's go 6 minus 2. If we're going to see this as terms, we want to see this as a positive 6. But the catch is when we see this as terms, the subtraction symbol turns into a negative symbol. So mathematically, this is read as 6 plus a negative 2. So 6 plus a negative 2, notice how that's going to be a positive 4. So in algebra, subtraction, we see this as two terms. So we include the negative symbol or the subtraction symbol, it becomes a negative symbol, and we actually put a plus symbol in front of that. So notice how these are equivalent. 6 lose 2 gives me 4. 6 plus negative 2 is 4. Notice how these are equivalent. So that problem there, not that big of a deal, but where it gets to be tricky is when I give you 7, take away a negative, say a negative 5. This is where it gets tricky. What we can do is see this as a 7, and if we circle this next piece here, we see this. So instead of saying removing debt is the same thing as adding income. So in math, one of the things we start to learn is this dash here kind of stands for to take the opposite of a negative 5. So if you see a dash in front of parentheses in algebra, that means to take the opposite of what's inside the parentheses. So the opposite of a negative is actually a positive. So my two terms are actually a 7 and a lot of times I'll put a plus sign for the word and the opposite of negative 5 is a positive 5. So 7 plus 5 becomes then this 12. So here's the one that we really want to look at, is this one. So when we see, say, a negative 5 take away a negative 2, this actually means, all right, I'm down 5, but I'm removing $2 of debt. But removing $2 of debt means I'm actually increasing by 2. So again, mathematically, this becomes negative 5. And what we can do is say, well, we're going to add, and the opposite of a negative 2 is actually a positive 2, because again, we're actually adding, increasing in value. So this problem really means the same thing as this. And then our answer becomes then this negative 3. So that's our thinking on adding and subtracting integers. Subtracting integers is where it gets difficult. So if you like to watch this video again, feel free to watch this video again, especially on this last part. So I think that's all we have. Oh, wait a minute. Got a few quick examples here. So let's look at a few quick examples here. So practice problems. You have $8 and you spend $3. Write and solve the integer equation. Okay. So if you want to pause this video and see if you can work out these examples, let's see if I have 5 of them here. Yeah, it looks like I have 5. So if you want to pause the video and work out those 5 and then start the video, you can kind of see what we got going on here. I'm going to continue on talking here. So if we reason this out here, you have $8 and spend $3. What kind of problem does that seem like that is? Is that an addition problem or is that a subtraction problem? So to me, I have $8 means that's a positive 8. But if you spend $3, that means you're removing $3 of income. So if I do that, 8 minus 3 turns into 5. So that becomes our equation. 8 minus 3 is equal to 5. So if I look at example 2, you owe $5 and then you borrow 4 more dollars. So to me, you're already down $5, but if you borrow 4 more dollars, you're adding more debt. So to me, that's going to be adding a negative 4. So if I'm down 5 and I add another 4 of a negative 4 to that, my total debt now becomes a negative 9. So if I translate that, I'm down 5 already, but if I borrow $4, I'm adding another $4 of debt to that. So therefore, my answer is a negative 9. So this next example, you owe $7 but receive $10 of income. So to me, I'm down 7, but if I receive $10, that means I'm going to increase my value by $10. So if I look at that, I'm going to be out of debt now. But how much debt am I going to be out of? Looks like I'm going to be out by 3. And also, again, mathematically, you could subtract 10 minus 7 because you're going to be not getting the whole $10 because since you owe that 7, you're still going to just be down this 3. But notice how since I had more income, that tells me that I have a positive 3 left over. So it's got to be positive. So now you have to compare those values to see if it's positive or negative. If I look at this example, you have $12. Well, that means you are starting with 12 and you pay off a debt of $6. Well, paying off a debt means you're removing $6 of debt. So if I'm removing $6 of debt, does that look right? Nope, that don't look right, does it? Paying off means I'm going to be losing, or I'm going to be combining that with a $6 debt. So I have $12, but if I pay off a $6 debt, that means I'm going to be removing $6 from my $12. So that means I should have $6 left over. So that statement should be correct. Or you could have said 12 minus 6 would give me 6 as well. So there could be a couple of different ways you wrote that. So notice how there's more than one way to write these, as long as the meaning is there. So let's look at this next example. You have $4 and then lose $9. So if you have $4 and lose, that looks like you're going to be going down 9. Looks like you would have that. So you're going to be losing $9. But notice how, if I look at this, this is really the same thing as 4 plus -9. So notice how, if you look at this, do I have more income or more debt? Notice how, since I'm losing 9, I'm actually going to be down more than I'm up. So notice how, again, 9 minus 4 is 5, but that 5's got to be negative since we had to lose more than we had. So -5 would be your result. So there's a little bit of review of adding and subtracting integers.